My name is John Kuhl, president of the Michigan Railroads Association, and we're a little bit compressed on time here, so we're going to get moving right along. The first speaker in this breakout session, Mr. Tim Hoeffner from MDOT. The pleasure to work with Tim for a long 8 months recently before joining the association over at MDOT. Tim Hoeffner is the Office of Rail Director. This new office has responsibility for all rail-related activities at MDOT, including the department's relationship with the rail industry, rail economic development, regulatory activities associated with grade crossings and rail clearances, funding for grade crossings and railroad engineering, as well as passenger and freight operations. He is also Governor Snyder's representative on the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, where he serves as vice chair. Mr. Hoeffner holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Michigan Tech. Tim has more than 30 years of experience and many assignments at MDOT, including administrator of the Intermodal Policy Division, where he served as policy advisor on critical transportation issues. And we'll hand over the mic to Tim now.
Thanks, John, and thanks for all your help in putting this event together today. I think so far it's really exceeded all of our expectations as far as attendance and quality and that of the presentations. And I know we're a little tight on seats in this room. Please, if anyone sees an empty chair, don't be shy. Please grab it. There's a couple of seats over on the other side, on the passenger side, but we're just flattered to have this issue where we don't have enough seats right now. So I'm going to give you a kind of a short overview of the Northern Michigan Freight Rail Economic Development study that we have going on. This is kind of something that, well, those that work with me and know me, I don't really know how we got to where we are on this thing, but it was one of those things where Director Steil and I were having a conversation one day, and it's like, what are we going to do to get these trucks off the highway? And it was like, well, I don't know. He goes, well, that's what I hired you for. And I said, well, no, that's why you didn't fire me, because I was already here. But no, we got to looking at it, and one of the things is that we have an awful lot of rail infrastructure, and particularly in northern Michigan and in the Upper Peninsula. And it is an underutilized asset, and we need to figure out ways that we can turn that into more of an economic engine. With the work that we've been doing with MEDC and with Peter Aniston in particular, and with the Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development, and there's just some real opportunities that we're seeing. We heard Jim Byron talking earlier today about the ag industry, and particularly how things are moving northern and up into more of the northern lower peninsula. We figured that we needed to do something to look at that. So this is really, I think I covered this already. It's what how do we better utilize this asset that we have? It's infrastructure, predominantly state-owned, although there are some pieces of it that are private sector owned. And how do we turn that into more of an economic engine? It was one of those things where you kind of come back to folks and you say, I need this RFP, and this is what I want to do. I think put together an RFP. Actually, the one that we should really hear from is Nikki Johnson on it, because she's the one that was hearing all of this stuff. But we really weren't sure what we wanted to do and where we wanted to go with it. But we knew that we had some stuff out there, and we had to get a better look at it. So this is roughly what we're covering in our area. And the line kind of moved, and it moved down south a little bit because one of the things that, from a transportation standpoint, we weren't necessarily all as attuned to the business practices in the state of Michigan as we should be, and you had to include all of the thumb and the connection to the rest of the state because of the agricultural breadbasket that the thumb area is, and then with all of the rail lines going into northern Michigan, how do we take and get more out of this? So that's where we decided that we needed to have an inventory, look for some recommendations from more on a regional basis, and some strategies for how we can work on these transportation costs and all of these things. There was a series of public meetings that the consultant held so far, and even without getting a I can never get it out. Tioga Group, but for me, I went to a couple of the meetings, and I went to a couple of the meetings in Alpena area and then over in the Traverse City area. And one of the first takeaways that I really got from that, which is something that we will be implementing, is that we just really need to sit down with our business partners. We need to sit down with particularly the county economic development people, with the MEDC economic people from the regions, and the businesses and industries in northern Michigan with our railroad partners, and just have a periodic dialogue. And we're probably going to be kicking that off after the first of the year. But these are just some of the recommendations and some of the case study work that will be coming forward out of the deliverables. The timeline, I think we're pretty close to on schedule right now. We'll see when we start to get into the development of the useful recommendations and all that, if we can stay on track. But hopefully by around Valentine's Day we won't have a massacre, but we'll have a celebration that we're finishing the consultant will be tying up the work on this. So far, as you can see, there's been, unit trains have been successful. There's a lot of elevators that have capacity. John, I thought that was some good comments that you were making this morning, or I think you did a good job of explaining a problem that we have when you were talking about Alpena, because everybody here thinks of an elevator and they think of just aggregating crops into it and shipping it out. But when you really start to think about it with the moisture content and drying and the mold potential and contamination and all of these type things of the crop, it brings up a whole area that we from transportation don't necessarily always think of. But that's some of the stuff that we need to think about. I think some of the stuff where we were talking about the intermodalism and the transloading and all that, that's really kind of interesting, because particularly as northern Michigan has been growing in the Traverse City area, the Gaylord area and the Alpena area, with some of the big box stores and that coming in, there's an awful lot of trucks that are heading up there. And it's like, is there an opportunity for some of the short rail freight shipment and that we could introduce here? And then of course it all comes down to, you can do all of these things, but investments have to be made. What's the proper role for the private sector? What's the proper role for the railroad? What's the proper role for the shipper? What's the proper role for the public sector, for state and local government? And how do we put this together? And then of course, as we heard earlier, most of this area is all served predominantly by short line railroads. And how do we make sure that everything we're doing feeds and works with the Class 1 carriers, and being able to get it to its final destination, or to the port, or as we heard with a lot of the agricultural products, to other places in Michigan. And I guess, yep, that was kind of what we were hoping to see. And I guess with that, are we going to do questions now, or? Okay, thank you.
So that map covers a huge chunk of the Lower Peninsula. Any plans for expanding it to include the entirety of the Lower Peninsula?
We want to wait and see what comes out of this. And I think the other piece is that Michigan Tech will be doing the companion piece for the Upper Peninsula next year. So that's, well, it's ongoing right now. Yeah, they got started on that. So right now we're concentrating on this. We got to see what the results are and how the strategies are. We focused on kind of where we were because of the way the Class 1 railroads work in Michigan. We tried to go pretty much north of where the Class 1s come through. I think there will be some work that goes on, maybe not necessarily a study of this nature, but we're already talking, and I mentioned it when Board Member Carper was talking about how do we take and better work with the freight railroads and economic development projects on the Amtrak and MDOT ownership, and then on the other Class 1 ownership. So.
Well, I can say there's a bunch of us here from the I-69 International Trade Corridor, Shiawassee, Genesee, Lapeer, and St. Clair. We're right on that border, and we have a high level of interest in this.
Yep, and we also know there's some things going on in Shiawassee County, and there's some interest there. And I've been talking with Steve Webster from Prima Civita, and the work that they're doing on the I-69 corridor and all that. So what I think we really see, though, is that there's more activity in the southern half of the state, and that we didn't see that level of activity going on in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. So that's kind of how we stepped into this. Okay, thank you.
There's a whole lot of information here for Posse, and it's mostly all good. But he's the director. I'm just going to say he's the director of rail transportation programs at Michigan Tech, and we'll hand it over here.
So I'd like to introduce myself normally as the flying fin with 3 accordions and one-way train tickets. So as Tim said, we are working kind of on a parallel study in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at the same time as Tioga is working with MDOT in the Lower Peninsula. And this is just a few things I wanna talk a little bit about where have we got so far. I'll show a little bit about the UP rail system. One of the tasks we are doing is related to interactive map. Then we are working on a shipper survey, and then I'll talk about what else are we going to do before we end the study, hopefully by end of January of next year. So the UP rail system is a little bit different than in the Lower Peninsula. We are definitely a rural and a lot of light density lines, but one of the unique things is that the majority of our mileage is operated by a Class 1 railroad, and that's Canadian National. Over 500 miles operated by them. We also have Escanaba Lake Superior, a little bit more than 100 miles in operation, but another 100 miles is being used for storage. And there might be some opportunities for reusing it for operations. We also have LS&I, owned by Cliffs, and they run the iron ore from the mines to the market docks. And then we have the newcomer. We have a brand new railroad, Mineral Range Railroad, working with Kennecott Mine, and they have 12 miles of track right now. Now, this came a little bit in the panel discussion earlier today. There was some discussion about trying to find have a location where there would be one spot where you can go and collect information or learn about what the rail system is. And that's one of our tasks as part of this study, is that we are working on developing a GIS-based rural rail infrastructure map for the state of Michigan. We're doing it for the UP, but we're also working on for the area where Tioga is doing their own study. And it will be internet-based, mainly for potential shippers and EDCs to find out information about the infrastructure. There will be no cost. MDOT is going to be handling that. It would provide information on rail lines and station facilities, locations, operating railroads, and so on. And we do have a prototype available right now. You can, if you follow that link, you can actually go to the internet, and you can go, and if you just hover your mouse on top of any of these segments, it's going to tell you which railroad owns it. If you go on top of any of those nodes, that's going to tell, all these little nodes are sidings or stations where you can potentially load. It's going to talk about the capacity and so on. As part of the shipper survey, we are collecting input from the shippers that what kind of things would you like to see in this map. And based on that, we are working with the railroad companies who've been very collaborative with us in providing that information. And the idea is that once we implement this, MDOT would be updating with the railroad companies every year. So it would be the one-stop shopping. Now, I do know that some of the companies are starting to do things like this on their own as well. So this is not necessarily the only solution, but at least there seems to be interest for that in the UP area. One of the things that we were looking at is obviously what kind of commodities are moving in the Upper Peninsula. And this may be a little bit hard to see, but if you look at rail movements in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, iron ore is obviously the biggest thing, and it's mainly the LS&I railroad moving close to 8 million tons from the mines down to the docks. It's a humongous volume when you look at the overall movement in Michigan. Now, once we take that one out, we definitely don't have huge amounts of tonnage in the UP, and that is one of the challenges. Now, we've also realized that the Transearch data that we use, and this talks a little bit what Ann Canby talked earlier, data is hard to come by. And I would say that it's not necessarily that reliable either, because we know for a fact that we are missing a bunch of short line data and some of the other information, so we're also trying to collect this directly from the shippers. But that's one of the challenges. How do you plan a system if you can't even get the data and understand what's moving? So I think we have, as a nation, we have a we need to figure out how do we get better data on freight movements. We also look at the truck side, and on the truck side, by far the biggest industry when it comes to freight movements is the lumber and primary forest products. About 6 million ton miles of those movements going on in the UP. So why are we so interested about this? Obviously, we are interested, well, is there opportunities for potentially using more rail? And when you look at these numbers, this is the commodities transported by truck based on the Transsearch database. Outbound, inbound, UP to UP, UP to LP, LP to UP. When you start looking, especially the UP to UP volumes, 3.5 million tons of forest products moved by trucks. And we know that some of these are moving up to 300 miles. And those are some of the movements that we are looking, what's the opportunities of potentially using rail for some of those. Also some of the outbound movements, which a lot of them end up going to Wisconsin. As I said, the other task that we have is we are working on a shipper survey. We've been doing that for a while. We thought it was going to take us about a month. We realized that this was not as easy a task as we hoped for. It's really kind of like pulling it out, literally going and pulling it out, the information from a lot of the folks. We opened it early July. It's online based. When I looked a week ago, we had 41 responses, but we really worked heavily on that. Now I think we are getting close to 60. And once again, we are also trying to get shippers from the Tioga study group area to respond to this survey. So far, most have come from UP. If you look at the respondents so far, about half of them are shipping only by truck. Rail and truck, about 1/3 or a little bit more than that. And then the rest is a little bit truck and water, and some that are shipping all rail, truck, and water. This kind of shows the respondents, manufacturing, big group of respondents. And then there's the other group, quite a mix of respondents. One thing that we are really trying to hit hard here is the logging and timber, because we really haven't got responses from them like we would wish. We know that we are missing a lot of data from that side, the forest products industry. Now, we don't have all the obviously detailed analysis. Still, we are still collecting the data, but we have looked into breaking down the shippers based on the inbound tonnage. And the bigger the circle is, the more tonnage there is coming in. And we've done the same thing for the outbound. And obviously, one of the things we are trying to identify is clusters of a lot of tonnage either leaving or coming in. Because that's, once again, if you're looking at rail, if you can build volumes in local vicinity, you have a better chance of actually using that for the opportunity. One thing that we picked up so far from the responses, and we asked a little bit, how has your rail shipments changed? And if nothing else, at least it's a little bit, it's somewhat promising. If you look at from the respondents, there's definitely more shippers that have increased their rail shipments or stayed the same over the past 3 years. And there's clearly some indication that there's interest for increasing the rail shipments. Now, the problem is, how do you make it a reality? So that's one of our jobs. And the next steps. One of the things we've been doing over the last month is talking with all the railroad service providers, trying to build a good inventory of the rail system in UP. But not only that, also talking about what are the challenges they face, and what are the things that they would like shippers to do to make their life easier. And we are doing the same thing for the shippers on the shipper survey. What would the shippers like railroads to do to make their life easier? And we'd like to kind of compare those answers to see that, are we always headbutting, or do we see some win-win solutions as well? We need to complete and analyze the shipper survey results. Hopefully within the next few weeks we can finally track all the responses. And like I said, compare what the suggestions we get from both sides. And then the last thing, we are looking into case studies, either companies who successfully used rail or who are really interested, have interesting case studies, like DA Glass is opening a new manufacturing facility just north of Houghton, and they're really interested in looking how can they get their glass into the rail cars somewhere in the UP. Another one is Northern Hardwoods, who would have export opportunities to Asia, but the fact that they have to trade the containers by truck all the way to Chicago is killing it. They say that we can easily compete from Chicago to China, but we can't get this first piece. We got to be able to get it to rail somewhere closer, and then we have no problem. We can export our materials and we can compete. But how do you get it to the rail somewhere closer? That's kind of the status update of our UP rail study. So if there's any questions?
I didn't catch where DA Glass is located, and also could you just talk a little bit more about that particular case study?
DA Glass is building a facility right next to the Houghton Hancock Memorial Airport. And I'm trying to remember the numbers off the top of my head. Well, let's just say that they're going to have regular movements from Detroit to the facility for inbound movements. They actually, what they do, they treat glass. But then they're going to have all the outbound products going all over the western United States. And I don't want to quote the numbers because I don't want to misquote them, but it is fairly significant, the numbers they are looking at the initial operation, but they are also looking at already at expanding it because they think the market is there. So.
Pasi, the question is that one chart you showed, changes in shipment by rail. Is that the number of shipments or the tons or carloads, or what is the dimensions of that?
That's a good question. This was just the number of companies who responded, they have increased their shipments. This didn't have yet the volume. We need to tie it because we have to pull the volume from one question and the answer from another question. So it was just the number of companies who responded that they have either increased their shipments or are planning to increase their shipments.
Hey, Pasi, you mentioned some of the trucks in the UP are running 300 miles, the timber trucks. I think you've told me before that around 100 miles is where the break-even analysis starts to break down. So are those companies just slowly going out of business, or are they just trying to stay afloat even though, they're really going underwater by continuing to run those miles?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, when we looked at that, and that's a little bit older study we did, so I don't know the exact numbers now. Those were based on movements from 2008 when we looked at that. And I'll tell you, when we told the trucking companies and the forest products companies that, that your trucks are running 250 miles, they were like, really? We didn't even realize that. So it's not a humongous percentage of the movements, but nevertheless, when you combine everything above, I would say even 150 miles, that's a really, really significant tonnage that could potentially move by rail. But it's not as straightforward as that, as Tom Teaser knows.
One other quick question, we heard a lot about transload facilities earlier. In the survey that was put, I think I've seen it before, but do you talk about transload facilities and ask if they would be willing to use them and actually where we could locate some of those?
I don't remember if we asked specifically if they are willing to use them, but that's one of the goals that there's Irfan Rasul standing. He's my graduate student, and his master's project, he's learning how to do optimization and shortest route paths and all these things. We are hoping to use these volumes and the origin destination pairs to let him do a little exercise to try to locate would there be a benefit of transload facility, and where would be the ideal locations for that. So that's going to be his master's project. I'll let you know how he succeeds.
Yes, it appears as though shipment out of the UP kind of goes to Chicago, kind of Chicago-centric idea. Is there any movement direction towards Duluth and then into the Twin Cities and up across the northern U.S.?
When it comes to rail from the UP, I mean, Tom actually could probably tell better, but I think everything goes through Wisconsin that leaves from, UP, Michigan. We can't get to Lower Peninsula. So it's either going to go through Sioux to Canada, or most probably it's going to take one of the lines going down to Wisconsin. And then most typically probably goes to, some of the products end up in Wisconsin. A lot of them, I assume, go to Chicago, and then they spread apart all over the place. So it's, and honestly, to us, the most interesting thing for us is not necessarily the final destination. For us, the question is, how do we get more effectively them out of the UP? Because after that, they're just going to flow wherever the CN lines go. Okay, so the question was, is it more effective to go to Sioux, to go to Canada? Once again, Tom might be better to answer that. It really depends where the final destination is. I mean, if you're going to Western US, no, you're going to have to go down to Chicago. Otherwise, you're making a huge loop. If you're going to the East Coast, I don't know, maybe CN routes some of the stuff through Sioux, but I think it depends also where they have yards to, shuffle the pack or classify the railroad cars. I think most of your movements, OCN movements, go down south though from the UP. I see a lot of nodding there. So.
All right, thanks a lot, Pasi. We need to move along here. Thanks a lot.